Hi, I'm Chris Molanphy from the Hit Parade podcast, and I'm this week's guest on Metapod.
This is Metapod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
Hi, I'm Kevin May.
And I'm Wendy Morrill.
And
we're
this week's guest on
Metapod. Okay, we're not, but that was kind of fun, wasn't it? All right, who's our guest this week, Kev? Tell us.
Chris Molanphy is our guest this week. It was actually in the intro, Wendy. And yeah.
Okay, yes, you're right. Tell us more then about this Chris Molanphy.
Yeah, so Chris is a writer and presenter of a monthly podcast called Hit Parade. It's a podcast devoted to the music charts, namely the Billboard's Hot 100 in the US and the intersection of culture and commerce, as you'll hear him say. And we must say this, actually. Happy
birthday, Hit Parade.
This week marks the 5th anniversary of the podcast, so many, many congratulations, Chris.
And to all those producers over the years that have cut and assembled all of those music clips for you, Chris. I mean, without them, we wouldn't have all those bass lines and hot guitar licks. So good job, Hit Parade team. It really takes a team.
Yeah, Chris has a lot of stories about the cultural and commercial aspects of popular music, and you'll hear quite clearly his enthusiasm for the topic, and probably a little bit of ours creeping in as well. He's really good at explaining how various aspects come together at a moment in time to make a song a hit. This is a longer than usual episode of Metapod, but we actually think you'll enjoy what Chris has to say about music. Plus, there's a bonus at the end. Chris reveals something rather interesting from his closet.
He does. All right, let's go then.
Okay, start the tape. Chris Molanphy, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of Metapod.
My pleasure.
Okay, and we thought we would dive in with a fairly provocative question, and then we can kind of really get to grips with the stuff that you're really interested in. And it comes from a respectable position.
Okay.
But I'm curious as to whether you think the concept of the charts, the hit parade, is as important now as it perhaps was in many of the decades in which your podcast kind of features.
This provocative question is a provocative question I've gotten before. Do the charts matter?
Yeah.
Why the charts? Why do you care?
Yeah.
What's funny is that as the yardsticks for music popularity have shifted, particularly in the streaming era, the digital era in general, which is about 20 years old, and the streaming era, which is now just shy of 10 years old, at least in America, the attention paid to the charts has only grown. If anything, they've, at least on this side of the pond, they've become quite democratized. You see folks paying tremendous amounts of attention to whether or not their favorite artist will get to number one, either on the album chart or the singles chart, week in, week out. BTS, the K-pop band, by some measures, the largest pop band in the world right now. Their last remaining goal before the middle of 2020 was to have a number one hit on the Hot 100 in America.
Yeah. And
they pulled out all the stops, recording in English for the first time, pretty much solely to get a number one in America. So the charts still matter to, even Generation Z, who are the ones who are, flooding Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, trying to motivate their favorite songs to number one. But yes, it's a different chart now than it was even a couple decades ago. The philosophy behind Billboard's Hot 100, very broadly speaking, has not changed since it launched in 1958. It's one chart to rule them all, I like to say. For most of its history, it combined two pools of data. sales of songs, whatever medium was hot at that time, be they 45 RPM vinyl, cassette single, CD single, the download into the 21st century, and radio airplay. And by the way, the inclusion of radio airplay makes the American charts quite unique compared to most countries' charts. The British charts, most European charts, the Australian charts, most Asian charts do not factor in terrestrial radio airplay. We still do, even in 2021. And I can explain why I think that's actually a good thing. But the philosophy behind this chart has not changed in 63 years. The one major thing that's changed is there are now 3 pools of data, the third one being streaming, which I liken to, if you want to take it way back to the 50s, I liken to a jukebox. Yeah. Folks have been saying for decades that the internet would eventually become the celestial jukebox. Very specifically, what it does is, the way it differs from both radio airplay and sales is it's a medium where the end user chooses the song but doesn't keep it. And that makes it philosophically different and unique compared to both radio airplay, where you don't get to choose the song, and sales, where you do keep the song. So the 3 of them together, it turns out when you average these different pools of data together, you get a pretty good barometer of what's most popular in the country. And you're averaging together what I call active fandom and passive fandom, which I think makes the Hot 100 very robust and a worthy chart to follow even today.
So, I mean, I think you've just given the charts 101 or charts for dummies pretty much right there, which was my question. But I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit about what specifically you focus on in Hit Parade, because I think you focus on a particular chart, and there are actually many, if I'm understanding correctly.
You are. And yeah, Billboard has literally dozens, quite possibly hundreds of charts. The number of charts is growing all the time. Not just by genre. Those have existed for decades. The country chart, the R&B chart, the rap chart has been around since the 80s. Modern rock and various other flavors of rock. There's now alternative versus mainstream rock. There are also different ways of cutting the charts based on, there's a chart that only focuses on radio airplay. There are actually many charts that only focus on various genres of airplay. There are charts that only focus on streaming, that only focus on digital sales or sales in general. I focus on the Hot 100, the one I was describing earlier, the flagship chart, overwhelmingly, because, as I say, it is the chart with the deepest history. It's now the oldest chart in Billboard. The only chart technically older is the album chart, but in a way, the album chart got rebooted in the 60s such that it isn't really the same thing that it was. And album commerce was much smaller in the 50s and early 60s than it is now. Whereas the Hot 100, more or less in this form, with massive change underneath, but more or less in this form has existed for, again, over 6 decades. I sometimes call it the Dow Jones of pop, because much the way the Dow on Wall Street is this very crude metric of how the stock market is doing, right? And if you're an actual Wall Street analyst, you have to use other metrics like the S&P 500 or, the Russell 2000 or whatever to measure, specific stocks and how they're doing. This one metric has existed for over a century. And folks still ask at the end of the day, what did the Dow do today? Yeah. And it's still a pretty good thumbnail sketch of how the market is doing. Much the same way I feel like the Hot 100 is a pretty good thumbnail sketch of how music popularity is doing.
I think it's interesting, just the context of what's been going on the last couple of weeks or months with a challenge to the status quo of Wall Street, with the Reddit and the GameStop saga that was unfolding there.
Yes.
Is there a challenger to the way the billboards, I know we've had the introduction of downloads and streaming and all those kind of things, but is there kind of a challenge to that entire concept based on something else that we perhaps, us lay people, haven't foreseen yet?
That's a good question, and I feel like I can answer it 2 ways. One way is any other methodology or, chart system a viable competitor to Billboard? By the way, when the Hot 100 was created in the 50s and right through the 80s, the 90s, there were multiple music industry tip sheets that had different charts. Radio and Records had a chart. Cashbox had a chart. So Billboard is just the one that has survived the longest. Yeah. But it was kind of always the flagship. The fact that the old Casey Kasem radio program from the 70s and 80s, American Top 40, used the Billboard chart, kind of institutionalized it, although in the industry, it kind of already was the institution. In the 21st century, I've, in the last 2 decades, heard of so many other chart systems that have tried to take a run at Billboard, be it Big Champagne at the end of the aughts, when they were trying to come up with a digital metric that even factored in some illegal commerce, like what people were trading on file sharing sites illegally and using that as a metric of popularity, to more recently, folks at Rolling Stone magazine in 2019, I believe it was, tried to launch their own competing charts. And then funnily enough, MRC Data, which owns Billboard, recently merged with Penske, the people who now own Rolling Stone. So I don't even know if the Rolling Stone charts are going to continue to exist anymore. They may be merged out of existence. Yeah. And so institutionally, to answer the first part of the question, nobody has really succeeded in knocking off the Billboard charts. There's something about that Hot 100 formula in particular and the way it morphs and evolves to take on new forms of commerce that makes it very malleable, very robust. And then if we want to extend the GameStop metaphor, right? Because what was the GameStop gambit all about? It was about, rank and file users attacking the stock market. You see that on social media every day, where fans of BTS or Justin Bieber or, Nicki Minaj, pick your fandom, are trying to pump up the streams and the sales of their favorite artist. And they'll even give each other tips like, don't put it on repeat, put it in a playlist and repeat the playlist, to try and get their song up the charts. And I often get asked in interviews, doesn't this mean the charts are just totally bogus and they're being gamed now? And honestly, I've looked at the underlying data, and it takes a lot when you're talking about a country as vast as the United States for one fandom to single-handedly force a song up the charts. You could argue that maybe BTS had several number one hits last fall, and the last one, Life Goes On, was particularly stoked by its fan base and didn't have a whole lot of radio airplay. Maybe on the margins, you could argue that the fan base concocted that, number one hit from thin air. But the sheer size of the data pool going into the Hot 100 tends to thwart attempts to game the chart. Yeah. Justin Bieber even had egg on his face about a year ago when he released his new single, Yummy, and attempted to give instructions on social media to his fans on how they could stream it. He said, don't mute it. You have to keep your volume up because Spotify will notice if you have mute on. And it was very embarrassing for him. He had to take the tweet down. And then his song wound up debuting at number 2 and not even going to number 1 anyway. So all the gamesmanship aside, the charts can be gamed, but not in as crude a way as I think the GameStop gambit would suggest.
I mean, some might argue that, gaming the charts that's what the marketing department of a record label is all about anyway, isn't it? Whoever's got the most money can put the most publicity out there anyway. Yeah.
And I'm not naive enough to believe that the charts are quote unquote pure, because the week you pick, the record label releasing a remix, the record label releasing a limited edition version on colored vinyl. Those are perfectly legal ways to quote game the chart. I mean, and that has existed as long as there have been charts. But, I see that as don't hate the player, hate the game.
So I'm going to date myself a bit here and say that I was a college radio DJ in the mid to late 90s. Fun. And when we talk about gaming the charts, well, maybe we won't talk about that, but it was all done by hand.
Yep.
I mean, there are other chart systems besides Billboard, as you were saying. I think in the 90s for college radio, it was CMJ and Gavin that were pretty popular. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they exist anymore, I'm sorry to say, but...
Not as such. I wrote for CMJ, actually. I wrote for the CMJ New Music Monthly, which was their consumer monthly back in the 90s. That was my first sort of paid music critic job.
Okay.
And New Music Monthly went the way of the dodo more than a decade ago, and the industry tip sheet, I think, is mostly gone. even the CMJ Festival,
Yeah.
which was the last of the New York
yes.
indie rock festivals, went out of business a few years ago, and they've tried several times to revive it, and they may still revive it. But
Well,
yeah.
maybe not if South by Southwest is around, but
right.
what I was going to ask is, the handwork that I remember being done at that time, and how has your job changed over time, or your hobby in analyzing the data? Is it easier? Is it harder because you have more data?
It's definitely an ongoing challenge. I mean, the reason why I have this gig is because I am a person who writes like a critic, but understands how the underpinnings of the chart work.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been following the Billboard charts since the 1980s. Speaking as a 49, almost 50-year-old, I've sort of watched this long enough that I've seen all of the varying ways that the methodology has shifted.
Yeah.
And I understand, sort of the minutia of, say, for example, going back to the late 90s, why Don't Speak by No Doubt never appeared on the Hot 100 and the technical reasons why that happened. I actually did an episode of Hit Parade explaining why that and other records were left off the chart in the 1990s.
Yeah.
And yes, I understand more or less I don't have inside information on, how the formula is calculated. I have an understanding of the broad strokes of how it's calculated. And it's definitely, it's a hobby that is never dull in the sense that it's an ever shifting thing. And to go back to what we were just talking about, the idea of gaming the charts, if there's a way to game the charts, the labels and the artists and the managers will do it. And of course, as they say, what's shocking is not what's illegal, it's what's legal. For example, Billboard for the last several years has been trying to put the kibosh on a very shady practice of bundling albums and to a lesser extent singles with merchandise, concert tickets.
Mm-hmm.
Billboard has finally, it seems, fully stamped this practice out, but they had to change the rules 3 times to get around the labels that were coming up with new clever ways to bundle an album with a ticket or merchandise. And Billboard now has rules such that it is still permitted, but basically the album has to be an add-on that people pay extra money for, and it has to be designated as such on the website where they buy it. That finally seems to have killed it, although I'm sure some creative record label is thinking up a new way that is technically legal, whereby they can bundle again and, artificially inflate an album on the charts. So yeah, it's the long answer to your question, but the short answer is yes, it's complicated, but you have to be sort of interested in these machinations.
So for the podcast, I mean, how are you approaching a theme or a topic for a particular show? Do you discuss that with someone, or do you come up with, do you run out of themes, or are there just endless themes, or, how? I just imagine this gigantic pile of data you have, and I wouldn't know what to do.
Well,
how do you approach that?
What I like about the podcast, it's a little bit like this series that I write for Slate called Why Is This Song Number One? If I can digress to that for just a second.
Sure.
What I like about the name of the series is that first word, why. Why means a lot of things. Part of it is me as a critic saying, well, I don't like this song very much, or I think this song is great. It's also explaining the hows and the wherefores, and both the song is an artistic statement and the song is a piece of commerce. And talking about both the art and the commerce. In terms of the podcast, I am thinking both like a critic and music fan and a chart analyst. So I'm always looking for stories. It's funny, I get people throwing ideas at me all the time, which is delightful because I love that people are so engrossed in the show that they want me to cover this and this and this. And I had to gently tell a good friend of mine one time that I was probably not going to be able to do an episode about my life with the Thrill Kill Cult because they just didn't have any chart hits. And more seriously, I get asked the question, well, why the charts? And it's because to me, there's always an interesting blend of art and commerce that leads to songs developing the following that they do. Even with, to your point, you were a college radio DJ in the 90s. That stuff was not absent of commerce. There was a commerce aspect to why, various indie rock acts got played the way they did. You know, I did an episode about the story of REM, and REM were on an independent label and gradually became one of the biggest bands in the world. And there was an art side to that, and there was a commerce side to that. So I'm always looking through the prism of the charts, but I'm always coming back to the art at the end of the day. I mean, I think people listen to my show not because I'm throwing a whole lot of data at them, but because while I'm throwing the data at them, I'm also playing songs, analyzing songs structurally. I'm not a pure musicologist. I don't have a music theory degree, but I understand enough basics of how pop songs work that I can explain some of the mechanics of them. How Phil Collins stumbled upon the gated drum sound that then spread across piles of hit 80s records, or how Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis came up with a chord progression that they wound up using on 5 separate hits. You know, that kind of thing is part of what makes the show interesting, I think. If it were just chart data, then it would only be of interest to chart nerds, and I'm aiming for something a little wider scope than that.
Who assembles your music clips in the episodes?
That would be my producer, who is currently Asha Saluja. I've worked with about 5 producers in the roughly 4-year history of this show. It's very labor intensive.
Yeah.
Although it's a lot of work for me as well, because as I'm scripting the show, I'm coming up with a song list and often directing my producer, no, I need this part of the song. So to pick an example that Kevin brought up before, my episode on Chic and Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards, I needed my producer not only to play Good Times by Chic, but in a specific spot to play the bass line of Good Times by Chic. There's a long bass solo in there that is vital, because then you're explaining to people, okay, here's how that became Rapper's Delight. Here's how that became Another One Bites the Dust by Queen. You can hear it deep in the mix of Rapture by Blondie. You can hear it in all these songs in later hip hop that sampled it. So yeah, that's quite a bit of work for both of us. But we've now been doing this long enough that we have developed systems for, it's a whole lot of Pro Tools and getting the script lined up just so with the song clips and the fade ups and so forth.
Let's move to a kind of a different part now. That for our listeners, Chris is sitting here wearing a Prince t-shirt. So it's very easy to get passionate about music when it's your favorite, right? So, for example, I loved the episode that I've just finished, which was the Lost and Lonely one, because it's got all of my faves about New Order, it's about Depeche, it's about The Cure, and all this kind of thing. Do you find it's easier to produce an episode for the bands that you really like, and then sometimes you're sitting there going, oh God, we've got to do one on fusion jazz this week?
So I'm always looking for the best stories.
Right.
And naturally, my brain gravitates toward the stuff I love.
Right.
I would say in the first year of the show in 2017, early 18, I blew through several of my all-time faves. I did a Donna Summer episode because I've been a Donna Summer fan since I was a kid. Growing up in Brooklyn in the late 70s, even though she's from Boston, Donna Summer felt like she was adopted by Brooklyn. Yeah. So, that one was catnip for me. I did a Prince episode, did an unusual thing where I compared him to the career of Tom Petty right after Tom Petty died, because they had both died within a year of each other. And for that one glorious night, they played together at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Right. And it is the only time they ever played together, but they were admirers of each other's work. And weirdly, their careers in terms of timing and certain beats, in terms of the way they fought their record label, the way they wrote for other people, there are lots of odd commonalities between Prince and Tom Petty that you wouldn't expect. However, to answer your question of what do I do when it's somebody I don't like, within the first year of the show, actually, I think on our 1-year anniversary, I did an episode about Bon Jovi. I am a renowned Bon Jovi hater. I have loathed Bon Jovi since high school. And I picked it. Nobody put a gun to my head and made me do an episode about Bon Jovi. In fact, the trigger for that episode, if you want to use the metaphor further, was Bon Jovi getting inducted in 2018 into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Yep. I happen to be a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame voter. I did not vote for Bon Jovi. I was sad when they got in, but I wanted to puncture my own bias, talk about Bon Jovi in the scope of the popularization of what is variously called hair metal, hard rock, heavy metal, etc. And like it or not, and I certainly don't like it, they were pivotal to the popularization of hair metal in the mid 80s.
Yeah.
They were the first hair metal act to consistently score number one hits on the Hot 100. Van Halen had one, but that was a fluke for Van Halen compared to Bon Jovi, who just had hit after hit after hit and turned metal into mass appeal, both genders, not just, pimply teenage boys, pop music. And it was a very rich episode, and I still get comments about it. People enjoyed the episode. I get people saying, I like Bon Jovi better than you, but I got to say you gave them their due in that episode. And that makes me happy. And then conversely, what also makes me happy is when people say, I didn't think I cared about X. I didn't think I cared about that song, and you made me care. This actually dates back to the origin story of the podcast itself. When I pitched the show to Slate's then head of podcasts, Steve Lickteig, who's now a friend, he's moved on, he's works for other people. Steve said to me, what would be the pilot? And I pitched him the pilot. I said the pilot would be about this UB40 song, Red, Red Wine, which was originally written in the 60s by Neil Diamond, and then in a weird fluke became a number one hit, not when it came out in 1983, but 5 years later in America in 1988, due to a DJ who went rogue and picked it instead of UB40's current hit and turned it into a number one hit. He said to me, Steve Lickteig, I hate the song Red, Red Wine, but that's interesting. I would listen to that. From there, I've had a number of people tell me I didn't think I cared about X, but that episode was great. That warms my heart.
Yeah, I didn't know that about UB40's Red Red Wine, the 5 years later thing. Interestingly, the Chic episodes, I kind of liked some of the music before. I was very, very aware of the work, but I was very lucky enough to see Nile Rodgers and Chic play at a festival here in the UK a couple of summers ago, and it was after seeing them and then listening to your episodes that it all came together. So it's kind of worked the other way.
Great.
So that's a comment rather than a question. So to flip it the other way then, what have been the favorite ones that you've got your teeth into just because it's a genre that you love, or it's all the bands that you particularly have fond memories of, etc., etc.?
Well, you mentioned the Lost and Lonely episode. Yep. I still get people coming back to me thanking me for that episode. Great. The oxymoronic premise of that episode is that these were bands that for most of the 1980s in America, all UK bands, were not hit makers. They couldn't get arrested on the charts. And then gradually, one by one, Depeche Mode, The Cure, New Order became hit makers. And it's like the center of pop moved toward them. I sometimes joke that there are episodes where, being a middle-aged white person myself, I'm throwing a bone to my fellow middle-aged white people. When I did the REM B-52s episode, REM were hit makers, but they weren't big hit makers. They don't have scads of top 40 hits. They have, about, I think, 4 top 10 hits, and maybe 7 or 8 top 40 hits. But I managed to thread a needle again, much like the Lost and Lonely episode, of talking about how a band like REM, which sounded so left of center when they came up in 1983 with Murmur, suddenly became the center of popular music by the turn of the 90s. So those two were very close to my heart. The Donna Summer episode was very close to my heart. The Bee Gees episode in 2018, I'd been sitting on that one for a while, and I was so delighted when I got to do that. You also asked the question of, is it harder when you like the act? Sometimes, or easier if you like the act.
Yep.
And the fact is, it's often harder because there's so much you're trying to pack in. The Bee Gees episode was a tough one. We had this vision for the show that the episode should be about an hour, maybe an hour and a quarter. And when that episode was pushing past an hour and a half, we thought, this is getting ridiculous. And I had to cut that episode to get it down just under 90 minutes. Now, ironically, we have 2-hour episodes or hour and 45-minute episodes. So we've completely blown past that artificial limit. But for a time, we were trying to make the episodes pithier. And, the Bee Gees really foiled that for me. It was hard for me to squeeze it all into a single episode.
One of the nice things you do in Hit Parade is you sort of uncover a cultural phenomena in music, and I think you've done this recently with the AC/DC Rule episode. You've gone over one-hit wonders extensively and outlined the criteria for those. My question is, and I'm thinking about the Lost and Lonely episode and that period of time for me personally, 1989. And Kevin knows that I always talk about this year as this important year. The Disintegration came out, and my question is, are there other factors? Of course, there are other factors that play into the phenomena that you uncover in Hit Parade. I mean, one of them might be tours, or I think you also talked about film.
Yeah.
Maybe TV or extensions of this cultural product that come out into music.
Yeah, if I can find some kind of cultural news peg for an episode, I'll do it. For example, I'd been thinking for several years that I should do an episode about Latin pop, and most especially the Latin crossover explosion of 1999, Ricky Martin, Enrique Iglesias, Jennifer Lopez, Mark Anthony. And what finally triggered it for me, frankly, I was a little late, was when I sat and watched the J-Lo Shakira Super Bowl halftime show in early February 2020, one of the last things we all got to do before the COVID-19 lockdown. I thought to myself, this is the peg. This is the thing that should spur me to finally do the Latin pop episode. And sure enough, that was our March 2020 episode. I did an episode about the career of Lady Gaga, which is interesting for multiple reasons. She really almost single-handedly at the end of the aughts pivoted the pop charts from the overwhelming dominance of hip-hop that had been dominating the charts throughout the aughts back toward an almost Eurocentric dance pop. But my trigger for that in early 2019, I believe it was January 2019, was the fact that she was about to get nominated for a couple of Oscars for A Star Is Born. And that gives you something to lead up to at the end. So yeah, I'm often looking for some kind of peg. In fact, I'm working on an idea for March of 2021, my next episode, that might be tied into a current movie. We'll see if it pans out, but I'm thinking this is my episode for next month. And yet again, because people are talking about this artist right now because of a current movie, that'll make it just more salient for people. And I love the story Kevin tells about how he saw Nile Rodgers live and then came back to the episode and it gave him more context. I'm always trying to think of ways to give people more context on things that are happening in the culture right now.
Something that Kevin and I talk about every now and then, because I grew up in the US and he grew up in the UK, and I remember the parental advisory labels that were on a lot of CDs in the 90s, Tipper Gore and that whole thing. I mean, I was wondering if you have an episode on censorship or advisory labels or anything like that, and how that has affected chart performance.
I haven't done one yet. I feel like I've touched on several of those artists in different ways. For example, the Two Live Crew have come up in at least 2 episodes. If I were to do that, the Two Live Crew would have to be pivotal to an episode like that.
Yeah.
The PMRC hearings in 1985, I think it was, would also be pivotal to that. And then you'd have to talk about everyone from Frank Zappa to Twisted Sister to, ironically enough, John Denver, who testified at the PMRC hearings, gave a very impassioned testimony. Haven't done it yet, but again, there's a good example, right? You're giving me the germ of an idea, and I'd like to do that idea, but then I have to think, what's the pivot point and what's the chart angle?
Sorry, I'm not giving you more work, though.
No, you're not. I mean, I file them all away. It's a monthly show. I'm only coming up with 12 of these a year, sometimes 11 if we take August off. So I'm always taking ideas and considering them and cogitating on them. A good example of this, in all seriousness, is 2 summers ago in 2019, my then producer, TJ Raphael, was leaving Slate. And on her way out the door, we were doing our monthly bridge episodes, which are sort of our interstitial episodes where we interview guests and do trivia and that sort of thing. It was her last episode. We were saying goodbye to her, and she said, on my way out the door, can I request an episode? And I said, for you, TJ, yeah, go ahead. And she said, I want you to do something about 90s women in rock and Lilith Fair and that whole thing, because that was the music of my teenage years. And I nodded and I said, live on the mic in our bridge episode, I said, that's a rich topic. I will definitely take that under advisement. I then did not do that episode for almost a year after she left because I had to think for a while of how I would capture that, because it's not a show about live music, right? It's not a show about a concert tour. Although interestingly, I end virtually every episode with a live recording, but concert grosses are not what I cover. And then eventually I kind of cogitated about it long enough and I realized, okay, it'll be about the rise of women in alternative rock through the late 80s, through the Suzanne Vega and Tracy Chapman period that then feeds into the early 90s, Liz Phair, eventually Alanis Morissette, and then Lilith Phair grows out of that, because that's a chart story as well as a live music story. And that was my June 2020 episode. So I'm taking ideas and trying to find a way of presenting it that feels like Hit Parade.
How often does a phenomena come along that you discover, like the AC/DC rule?
I mean, that was something I made that up.
Sure.
Full disclosure, as I admit in the episode, it's a term I coined to capture something I noticed about the charts all the time, which is that when you tell people that Depeche Mode's only #1 album in America is Songs of Faith and Devotion, they kind of screw up their heads and say, wouldn't it be Violator? No, it's the one after Violator. Or you tell people Jethro Tull's first #1 album is Thick as a Brick, and they go, wouldn't it be Aqualung? No, it's the one after Aqualung. So the AC/DC rule was, and I named it after AC/DC just to summarize for folks, because AC/DC's first #1 album in America is not Back in Black, one of the best-selling albums, period, of all time. It's the one after Back in Black, For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, an album that sold 1/6 as much as Back in Black did. Hence, I named it the AC/DC rule. Generally, the opening of an album is a referendum not on the current album, but on the previous album. And it explains why movie blockbusters, the sequel always opens better than the first one, why later installments of a blockbuster book series open bigger than the previous Harry Potter or Twilight or, Hunger Games. Sequels generally do better, and they may be the #1 hit, but then they may be less well remembered than the slower growing prior record was. That was just one that I had been tinkering with in print for years. I finally got to put it down on paper or, virtual paper for NPR Music about 6 or 7 years ago. And, they let me define the AC/DC rule. And always in the back of my head, I thought someday this is going to be a podcast episode. And finally, February of 2021 felt like the time to do it. So here we are. There aren't too many charty concepts like that. Okay. The One Hit Wonder episode that you mentioned earlier, I'd been sitting on that one for a while. I did an installment of an old chart column about a decade ago, trying to define what a one-hit wonder actually is, right? Because everybody seems to have their own definition of what a one-hit wonder is. And I tried to come up with 3 sort of meta rules for what makes an act a one-hit wonder.
You really hang VH1 out to dry on that one.
I kind of did. Because okay. I needed a straw man.
Someone has to.
I needed a straw man. If that VH1 one-hit wonders countdown came on right now, I would watch it again. I mean, I'm a sucker for that kind of thing. So it was poked at with love, but it provided a nice straw man because it was 100 songs. So it was a nice round number. And I could say, okay, what percentage of these songs would I actually consider one-hit wonders? And I said, well, if you go by this rule, you have to eliminate 3/4 of the list. Well, maybe that rule is too extreme. Okay, what if you went by this rule? Well, then you'd only have to eliminate about 25%, and that made the VH1 list useful.
I think you use some funny words and cultural references, and I was wondering, you said poke, a friendly poke there. Do you get any interesting feedback from listeners who are maybe outside of the US or maybe didn't grow up in the US? I think the one that made me laugh out loud walking the other day was you were referring to You Shook Me All Night Long being that song that you've heard at every wedding that you've ever been to. And I just thought, wow, that's true.
But it may be culturally specific to your
Right. I mean, how do you choose these places to poke at things? And does anyone ever try to stop you?
sometimes maybe they should stop me, but, and I try to,
No.
I try to confess my biases where I can. I'm always looking for ways to make the audience go, oh yeah, like, oh, I've experienced that,
Yeah.
that's the song about the such and such with the so and so. Because I'm trying to, even though I am a deep pop music nerd who's been following the charts for the better part of 40 years, both in my column, Why Is This Song Number One, and on the podcast, I'm always thinking of particularly the person my age, in my late 40s, who cares about pop music but hasn't been paying enough attention. And it's like you're poking them and saying, yeah, remember that song? It gets played at every wedding you go to. I've made that reference, by the way, in several episodes. I also point out that Hey Ya by Outkast in my Outkast episode. Hey Ya, for a time, I think it's less true now, but there was a period in the late aughts where every wedding you went to, they were guaranteed to play Hey Ya by Outkast. So there are certain songs that are kind of the wedding DJ's friend.
I tell us, Chris, have you pissed anyone off, like a record label or a band, through any of your narration or the narrative that you followed during some of the episodes, or the way you've interpreted why they didn't reach a number in the charts or why they did, or anything like that?
Fortunately, I've never been put on blast by any of the artists. I've gotten a teeny bit of feedback from some of the artists I've covered. When I did the Donna Summer episode, I talk about her two producers, Giorgio Moroder and Pete Bellotti.
Mm-hmm.
And Pete Bellotti emailed me. And whenever I get an email from a famous person who has heard my show, I kind of duck under the desk, expecting to be told everything you said was wrong. And he and I exchanged maybe 2 rounds of emails where he mostly said very kind things. I could tell the way he was phrasing things that if we had gone a 3rd round of email, he might have said, you didn't quite get this right. But he kind of left it there and seemed like a very polite gentleman. And so I just said, all right, Pete Bellotti likes the show. I'm going to declare victory and move on. After I did the Janet Jackson episode in September of 2019, I got followed by Jimmy Jam on Twitter. And when I noticed that he had followed me, I got very nervous because I promulgate a theory in that Janet Jackson episode that is based only on something I noticed. It's one of those Chris noticed this sort of things,
okay.
Which is that there's, again, I think I mentioned this earlier, this chord progression that I call the rain sound that recurs in 5 hits by Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. They interpolate the melody. They're not carbon copies of each other. They're not purely ripping themselves off, but they replicate this feel in 5 different hits. I noticed that Jimmy Jam was liking several tweets of mine where I'm having exchanges about the Janet episode and even the rain sound. And I thought, okay, I'm going to regard that as an endorsement by Jimmy Jam that I observed something true. No, I get pushback sometimes from individual fans.
Okay.
I poked fun at the Grateful Dead in my One Hit Wonders episode. Yeah. I didn't poke fun so much at the Dead as I poked fun at the Dead fan. I affected this obnoxious accent, pretending to be a straw man Dead fan, talking about how, by some measures, the Grateful Dead could be considered a one-hit wonder. Because
I do think you had a good pun there as well.
Yeah, I did.
Reaching pretty high on the chart or something.
It never got any higher, and then I went, that wasn't what pissed him off. What pissed him off was when I said, imitating the faux Dead fan, the Dead weren't about the charts, man. Because truthfully, every Dead fan, every Deadhead I've ever met, they're like, well, you have to realize it's not about the charts with them, man. It's, it's not even about the album. It's about the live show.
Well, it is.
I've heard so many variations on that. It was, and right. And it, by the way, they're right. What makes the Dead interesting, if you are a Deadhead, which I am not, is the live show. But I just wanted to poke the gentlest fun at the whole Dead aren't about the charts, man. And I got one Deadhead writing me, says, you didn't have to be a dick about that, So, I get that occasionally, but no, luckily I've never been put on blast by an artist, including by John Bon Jovi, who I said some fairly nasty things about in the Bon Jovi episode. But he's too busy sleeping on a pile of money to care about my stupid podcast. So.
If you could identify, Chris, what would you consider to be the most pivotal kind of chart moments in that 40 years that you referenced earlier about that you've been kind of nerding out on the charts and the data, if you're able to think of
Yeah.
those.
Yeah, I definitely am. I mean, okay, not just me, anybody who follows the charts. I often say this is the BCAD moment in chart following in America, is the moment in 1991 that Billboard uses SoundScan for the first time on the charts. To summarize for everybody, prior to 1991, the charts were compiled using a system whereby they would call retailers, call up radio stations and say, give us your top 30 records this week. And then they would weight those numbers. It wasn't as if the system wasn't built on data. It was actually built on a lot of data, but it was the phrase I often use is fudgeable data, and frankly, easily corruptible data. So if the label leans on a retailer or leans on a record, a radio station and says, "Psst, when Billboard calls you this week, say you played the such and such record." This is how payola works, right? SoundScan didn't fully eliminate payola, but it made it a lot harder to cheat a record up the charts, such that Billboard, to this day, refers to everything after 1991 as the SoundScan era. It really is like the BCAD moment of chart following. And what's momentous about it, and I've talked about this in several episodes, is it didn't just change which records were moving up and down the charts. It improved the chart fortunes of whole genres. The two that everybody points to are country and hip hop. Suddenly went from genres that the records would peak way down on the chart to topping the chart regularly. The episode I did in November of 2020 about the chart career of Garth Brooks. Garth Brooks' entire career can be credited in part to SoundScan, because SoundScan revealed that Garth Brooks was selling more records than anybody in any genre in the 1990s. More than Mariah Carey, more than Pearl Jam, more than anybody. And then in hip hop as well. Hip hop getting its due on the charts in starting around 1991 was all about SoundScan, revealing that hip hop was not a fad, that, you know, rap sold all over the country, not just to African American fans, that even if radio stations were afraid to play it because it might alienate certain listeners, it was extremely popular with teenagers and 20-somethings. And that changed the game entirely. So that's the biggest one. There are others, but that's the one I often point to first.
Yep.
The others, I mean, include like the moment when Billboard in 1998 had to acknowledge the fact that retail singles in stores were not getting released anymore because the record labels wanted you to buy the full-length CD. And so they kind of threw in the towel and allowed radio-only songs to appear on the chart. That was a big moment. The moment when digital songs, dollar downloads, the 99-cent iTunes download got added to the charts in 2005. That was a big deal. The moment when Spotify and YouTube are added to the chart in 2013, 2012. And what's interesting is that each of these innovations fundamentally changes our understanding of what is a hit. That's the part that's interesting.
Now, when we'll post the this episode on metapodshow.com, we always put our recommendations for episodes. You know, for a serial podcast like yours, we say these are the ones that we recommend that people should try first if they are brand new to it. If you could pick 3 of your own episodes as a introduction rather than starting at the beginning and coming to the end, what 3 would you recommend our listeners to go for?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. And of course, it's like picking among your children. They're all
Exactly.
my favorite. But okay, one that does leap to mind based on what I was just talking about with the SoundScan moment is an episode I did all the way back in the first year. I sort of felt like I had to get this episode done in the first 5 episodes because it formed a baseline for everything I did after. It's called The Great War Against the Single episode.
Okay.
And it's basically explaining, and a lot of people thanked me for this, explaining why in the mid to late 90s, when you went to a music store, you had to buy, in America at least, a full-length CD if you wanted to own a hit song. Why is it that if I just want to own Tub Thumping by Chumbawamba, I have to buy this $15.99 Chumbawamba CD? Why is it if I want to own Lou Bega's Mambo No. 5, I have to buy the Lou Bega album? And that was very deliberate on the part of the record labels. And I explained how it skewed the charts. It altered our understanding of what songs were hits. The theme from Friends should have been a number one hit, I'll Be There For You, and it was not because it was not released as a single. Don't Speak by No Doubt should have been a number one hit. It was not because it was not released as a single. Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls. There are several songs that could have been number one hits. So that's one.
Okay, two more.
Two more.
Yeah.
One that people tell me they really like because it does the art and commerce thing well and the following an artist's development story well is my episode on Genesis and all the careers that grew out of Genesis. Phil Collins, Peter Gabriel, Mike and the Mechanics. What's great about it is it's got a pivotal chart moment where in the summer of 1986, this has never happened before or since, I think, a band and the former member of the band are fighting each other on the charts and one knocks the other out. So basically, Invisible Touch by Genesis is number one in July of 1986. And the very next week, Sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel knocks it out. That is a once in a blue moon chart occurrence. And I use that as the pivot point to go back all the way to the early 70s and, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway and, the Genesis that Peter Gabriel was a part of. Mm-hmm. And then I talk about how all those careers fan out and the very unusual way that Phil Collins stayed in Genesis while maintaining a very active solo career. That's rare as well, right? Normally, a solo career is the signal that somebody's leaving the band. In fact, Phil Collins going solo made Genesis bigger and Genesis made Phil Collins bigger. And that's very unusual. So that's a good one.
Is that unusual? Sorry to, because you're going to give us your third one in a minute because we're going to make you do that. But is that the solo thing? Is that true today, possibly?
I suppose
people go off and do like a spin-off career, possibly.
There are different examples. The Wu-Tang Clan, among rap groups, they did solo projects and would then come back to the nest. But no, I think it's mostly still true. Look at One Direction, for example. All 5 members of One Direction have had solo careers. Harry Styles, Zayn Malik. Nobody's saying a word about the possibility of One Direction coming back together. When Justin Timberlake broke from NSYNC 20 years ago, NSYNC have made a couple of special live appearances, but NSYNC aren't getting back together. Yeah. So by and large, the rule still holds.
I kind of led you to this one because obviously Depeche Mode have had Martin Gore and Dave Gahan have had solo careers.
Fair. And I think the difference is that those weren't big hits. If either one of them had been a big hit,
that's very true. That's so true.
Then who knows? Martin Gore might have said, sod it. I'll just keep doing this. And never coming back. When they come back with their tail between their legs, it's probably because, it didn't do that well.
Okay. And your third recommendation for us then?
I'm torn between 2 episodes. I'll go with, because of length, the one from just a month ago, the Chic episode, because it's the longest episode in the history of the show. It's artists I love. I really love Nile Rodgers, and it's got so much variety. One of the kindest comments people have told me when telling me they enjoyed the show is, I didn't realize Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards wrote and produced all that stuff, because it's not just Chic. It's not just disco. It's David Bowie and the biggest hits Bowie ever had. It's the B-52s. It's Duran Duran. It's Madonna, Like a Virgin.
I think it's the Chic universe.
My entire childhood.
The actual title of the episode is These Are the Good Times, and I refer to it as the Chic universe of hits. So yeah, I guess those are 3 representative samples.
So Chris, quick round of little more personal questions to wrap up here.
Sure.
What was the last gig you went to?
I'll throw in this one. If the lockdown hadn't happened when it happened, literally 2 days later, my wife and I had tickets to see Josh Ritter, who's this sort of Americana folk pop artist, very, popular on AAA radio. He was playing in Brooklyn, and we had tickets for him that Sunday. And that concert was pulled at the last possible minute. You're asking me the last live music I saw, it was December 2019. My friend, pianist and songwriter Julian Villard did a show at Joe's Pub in New York City with his sometime backing band, the Jubadors, and it was a Christmas show, Christmas 2019.
Okay.
So it has now been well over a year since I've seen any live music. So long answer to your question.
First album that you ever bought or owned?
I answer this very briefly two ways. The first album I consider sort of a pop album that was mine and not my parents', and not a Sesame Street album, is The Police's Synchronicity, which was given to me by my grade school bestie for my birthday in 1983. However, if you're asking which one I paid my own money for, about 6 months after that, I paid my own allowance money to buy the Footloose soundtrack in the spring of 1984.
Favorite track on Footloose?
The second of the two Kenny Loggins hits, I'm Free, Heaven Helps the Man, I think is probably my favorite. Either that or Bonnie Tyler's Holding Out for a Hero.
And do you have a favorite live album?
Oh, yeah.
Ooh, that's a good.
That's a good one. Okay, I'm going to go deep on this one. I may regret forgetting another great live album. I mean, there are classics like James Brown Live at the Apollo, but here's my deep cut. Joe Jackson Live 1980 to 86. The, former angry young man of the turn of the 70s, 80s. What's exceptional about that album is that he recreates all of these singles hits that he's had and refuses to do any of them the way they sound on the record. And not just in the way you normally expect a live album to feature jams. It's not like that. He does 3 different versions of Is She Really Going Out With Him in 3 utterly different styles. One way as a jazzy rock combo, one way a cappella, other than a lone tambourine, and one way with orchestral backing. And it's amazing. Everything on that album is amazing. So yeah, that Joe Jackson Live album has been a favorite of mine for a very long time.
I do believe you said you went to the Prayer Tour in 1989.
I did.
Featuring Love and Rockets, Pixies, The Cure. I'd like to know if you bought a t-shirt.
I did. In fact, do I have it here? If you give me a minute, I can check. I may have it here. This will take 1 minute.
Go for it. Go.
I probably had the same one.
This is where we need some of that incidental music, or you start singing, one of the two, Wendy.
Folks, he's gone to the closet to get the Prayer Tour t-shirt.
While we're waiting for Chris to come back, Wendy, do you tell us your answer to the questions that you posed to Chris there? So first, album.
Favorite live album, I think I'd probably say 101.
Depeche Mode, yeah.
First thing I bought, I don't really remember. My first live gig was The Romantics.
Okay.
Here he comes, everyone. There it is.
There he is. He's holding up his Cure prayer.
I had a different one. Okay. This was the Giant Stadium show?
That was the Giant Stadium show in August of 1989.
Okay.
I often say that that's tied with Prince on the Musicology tour for my all-time favorite concert. Mm-hmm. Not just for how well the bands played and the Cure were amazing, but for the crowd. The idea of putting thousands of goth kids in a stadium on a dog days evening of, August in New Jersey.
Telling you, 1989 was a magic year.
It was a magical year. It was the year I graduated high school, and all of that music is deeply meaningful to me. So, yeah. So yes, there's my t-shirt. And the funniest thing about this t-shirt, I can still wear it because if you will recall from the late 80s, when you went to a concert, you always got the extra large and let it drape down your skinny teenage body.
Big t-shirt.
Well, I am now a middle-aged man and, weigh quite a bit more than I did as a teenager. And so this is more or less a medium now, and I can wear it.
Well, that's good. Good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chris Molanphy of Hit Parade, for being here on Metapod. It's been fun.
My pleasure. No, this was fun. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Chris for a really enjoyable chat. We both loved doing this one.
Yes, and thanks for showing us that t-shirt from The Cure's Prayer Tour in 1989, Chris. We're glad that it still fits. Please think of us the next time you wear it. Since Hit Parade is a monthly show, we hope this filled the gap in your Chris Molanphy fix for a bit. As we mentioned, Hit Parade is a Slate podcast, so you can find that at slate.com, along with Chris's other music analysis for Slate. You can also follow Chris on Twitter at @CMolanphy. There are, of course, links at the Metapod website for you. And, hey, remember last week you said you were working on your calm and pleasant voice? How's that going, Kevin?
Well, I've decided, Wendy, that I'm never going to reach the heady heights of my co-host. I don't mind saying this. Just before we were recording this, my daughter came in and said you had a very calm and soothing voice, so I don't need to compete at all. It's all down to you.
And then she quickly left after she found the chicken nuggets.
Indeed she did.
All right. Well, you know, I can't compete with chicken nuggets, but I tried. I'll stay tuned for your progress because I have faith in you. And how about you tell everyone what's coming up next on our show?
It's actually one of the favourite parts of this show, actually, where we kind of tee things up. So we've got another great podcast presenter from the Slate family coming up in May. That's Willa Paskin from Decoder Ring, which is an equally fun and analytical show that unravels interesting cultural mysteries like mullets, blue food and unicorn poop. Yes, that's the first time I've ever uttered those two words. So go me, unicorn poop. But hold your mullet jokes, or indeed hold your mullets for a little while longer. We are welcoming Laura Palmer of Island Crime to Metapod on May the 5th. Island Crime is a Canadian true crime series, and we've been talking to Laura about the first season of her podcast, which was called Where is Lisa? It's a yet to be solved missing persons case from the Vancouver Island area. It's a brilliant podcast, and we were very happy to speak to Laura a couple of weeks ago. So meet us back here for that.
Yeah, definitely. And that's all for this week.
Okay, we'll see you next time.
That's it for Metapod this time. Thanks for listening. Metapod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. Metapod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.